Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Joining me this morning to talk a little bit about the latest developments in and around Chaco Canyon. Regular guest on this program, Paul Reed, is here from Archaeology Southwest. He's joining us remotely this morning from his home in the Taos area. There he is. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
Thank you. Thanks for speaking with us. And as we've been visiting about just before we came on the air this morning, there's been some new discussions about some of the protections around Chaco Canyon, nothing to do with the boundaries of the park itself, but you and I have talked about this multiple times about the potential threats to the area around Chaco Canyon, and so it's back in the news. Tell me what's the latest? What's going on? Something new from the Trump administration?
Right. And at this point, it's I'd say slightly above the level of a rumor. They are, this is Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum. They're definitely going to take some type of action on Chaco's 10-mile protection zone. And what they've said, really quasi-informally at this point, is that the options are, just do away, revoke it entirely. Second one, potentially reduce it in size to 5 miles. And number 3 is leave it alone. But I think given this administration's push to, bring more and more oil and gas potential, I guess. Really, when we talk around Chaco, it is about potential only, Scott, because as we've kind of noted, this 10-mile zone around Chaco is not productive for oil and gas. If it was, and it had been, there would already be, a lot more oil and gas wells than exist right now.
Right.
So this is an extremely marginal area from that standpoint. And I think that, even the folks on the industry side would probably look at it that way and might concede. But anyway, that's what we're looking at. The Department of Interior, DOI, did convene a meeting with tribes to begin to discuss this, and I wasn't in the meeting and can't really discuss any details at this point. There might be some press that comes out later, but basically the gist of it was they wanted to begin a dialogue. So that makes this a little interesting. There hasn't been anything published in the Federal Register. Here's the action we want to take, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, there's something coming. So
okay, gotcha.
That's kind of the point we're at.
Interesting, got you. And so this would be, I guess, then a reaction to or similar to what former Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland did when she was in office, then to put this 10-mile buffer around the park boundaries of Chaco Canyon. This would be then in answer to that, I guess, is what you're hearing or what you're suggesting?
Yeah, what we're also seeing right now is, there's this administration doesn't want to see any restrictions in place for energy development. And so this is part of sort of that larger scale, really west-wide, countrywide movement to open up areas that potentially haven't been developed for energy and
right,
that may or may not need to be developed. It is sort of the irony of the time, Scott, as we've discussed at different points. It was during the Obama administration that the U.S. became the largest net exporter of oil and gas worldwide. So we haven't had any real reductions, even with 8 years of President Obama, with the first Trump administration, and then under Biden. We really haven't seen any major reduction in the oil and gas produced in this country. So talking about this as though, there was we turned off a faucet, in 2021 is really just not sort of a realistic way to talk about it. Now, if they were to say, well, we just want to really increase the opportunities for oil and gas companies, that does seem to be what they're interested in doing. So those of us sort of trying to continue to do the balancing thing, right? let's protect our public lands that are super important to the vast majority of Americans and the vast majority of New Mexicans. Let's continue to support responsible oil and gas, both exploration, development, production. Yes, we want to do those things, but we don't have to open up every last area potentially to oil and gas, especially areas that haven't produced really at all over 100 years, in New Mexico.
Right. Gotcha. But of course, there is some reactions already coming out, right, from some folks. You shared with me, and we'll share it on the screen in just a moment, a letter from the governor of Acoma Pueblo about their concerns about this and wanting a more unified response, maybe from tribal entities and pueblos in the area.
Right. I mean, this is something that took years to develop. I mean, we've, for really more than 10 years, Scott, I've come on various points in time during our normal slot here to talk about how different groups have gotten behind protecting a 10-mile zone around Chaco. So I think the first talk of this literally was 2014. So we're looking at 11 years here. This went through a very long vetting process. This was announced in November of 21, and then went through a 2-year process with public meetings, with comment, with everything, and with meetings with different tribal entities. So I think that the Pueblo of Acoma's reaction at this point, and some of the other Pueblos, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, talking about, the 10-mile zone, which protects ancestral sites of theirs and of, Navajo folks through time, Hickory Apache, all the historic sites. I think it's quite reasonable for them to be concerned about, what seems to be coming our way. The other thing that's been kind of interesting is this idea that, this 10-mile zone was imposed without any consultation with local folks. And, that's just simply not true. The Department of Interior had meetings with the Navajo Nation president. There were hearings held in Navajo country, in Albuquerque, in Farmington. So, they went through a really full and complete process to do this. I have seen reports in the media that, there wasn't proper consultation. So I think that's a bit of an attempt to rewrite the script. And, if folks want to nerd out on the details, there's a very lengthy record of all the meetings, all the interaction that happens, and different individuals
Sure.
coming forward and entities coming forward and talking about this. So,
Right.
What's interesting at this point is no formal announcement yet that this is going to be revoked or rescinded. If they do that, then they're required to go through a similar process through the National Environmental Policy Act to get public comment and to see how, the broad sort of swatch, if you will, of New Mexico and folks who are concerned feel about it. So I hope they'll honor that process.
Sure. We'll have to wait and see, I guess, as you said. But this is kind of what is maybe coming down from the Department of the Interior. I guess, as I recall, when Secretary Holland put in the 10-mile buffer, that was also not a unanimous decision, I think, right? Some were advocating 5 miles, some for 10, and she chose 10. Isn't that kind of, am I remembering that correctly or not?
Yeah, the Navajo Nation government was initially on board, and this history is, I think, important for folks to hear. From about 2015 through late 2019, the Navajo Nation government, 2 presidents, both President Nez and President Benally, said, we support this. This is a good thing. There was a change in administration. Some other folks elected to the Navajo Nation Council starting in 2020, and then that position evolved to, we either want a 5-mile zone of protection or we want none at all. So that's something that's been a bit of a moving target through time. And we've also talked about this a lot, Scott, the issue about if oil and gas development doesn't happen on federal lands in the 10-mile zone, how does that impact people who might want to develop their own lands? Well, numbers, I saw some pretty crazy numbers thrown out about how tens of millions of dollars were going to be taken out of people's pockets. Well, anyone who has previously leased their land, allotted lands around Chaco to an oil and gas company has an existing agreement. Everything moves forward, in the same way it has. So, again, this is unfortunately sometimes about trying to get messages into the media that aren't really telling the full story. So I think it remains to be seen how that goes. I do think that there will continue to be opportunities for folks if they want to try and lease their lands. But circling back to what we just talked about, this area around Chaco is not prime development country for oil and gas. It simply is too much effort, too much work to extract the product and then have what seems like a reasonable profit on the other side. So we would have to see much higher oil and gas prices, no matter which lands were available or which lands might be withdrawn or protected. So I think it is important for folks to understand this in this larger context of the economic forces, which, basically shape our world.
Right, right. Also, Paul, you were sharing with me too an op-ed piece from the Santa Fe New Mexican that was just printed less than a week or so ago, I guess, too, also talking about Promises to Chaco Must Be Kept is the title of it, by Charles Riley. Talk to me a bit about that piece as well.
Right, right. So this is the current Acoma governor, and as you know, Scott, and our listeners do through the discussions we've had, Acoma Pueblo has been way out in front on this for more than 15 years at this point, and really leading the effort to have their ancestral lands, the ancestral lands of Pueblos, the ancestral lands of Navajo folks protected through this process. So Governor Riley here in this op-ed is essentially saying, we've gone through this process, and tens of thousands of comments came in, and the people spoke, and this is overwhelmingly supported across New Mexico and across the Southwest. So let's continue to keep this protection zone, in place. And so I really do hope that Secretary Burgum can hear this and understand that, for those of us who live in the region, certainly folks in your listening zone here, Chaco Canyon is not a political football. This is a very special, sacred, wonderful place, no matter what ethnic group you belong to or where you're coming from. This is an amazing part of our public land legacy. And Chaco is a World Heritage Site. So I think that, I hope enough local people can speak out about this if we do see, formal action to rescind this zone of protection. Because this is such an important area to really the vast majority of people.
Right, definitely. And so I guess what's next, Paul Reed, as we talk about this on the radio today, you've mentioned that there is rumors of this happening, but until it actually happens, are folks just kind of getting prepared, I guess, for this potential fight, or waiting to see what will happen? What do you think is happening out there?
Yeah, I think, they had a formal meeting with tribes, which they said was formal, and then apparently, there was some question about how formal it was. So we've kind of risen above, I heard from so-and-so at so-and-so. So I suspect that there is something coming fairly soon. At this point, I think it's really about looking at the values that we embody, that organizations like ours, our tribal partners and friends, all the nonprofits, all the environmental groups, and really the large swath of the American public just needs to begin to think about this. What do we value, and what are the trade-offs that are acceptable in our everyday lives? And do we really need to potentially increase oil and gas production in what is, pretty much universally acknowledged to be a very marginal area for that? Or is it okay if we simply leave things the way they are, protected, and then have that energy, focus shift to areas that do not have amazing places like Chaco Canyon? And, this is something that we've talked about a lot, but it really is important to keep in mind that our public lands have many, many, many sacred sites, archaeological sites, cultural sites, historic sites, and that if we're going to have that legacy moving forward, we have to have reasonable measures in place to protect those areas. And then we need to consider carefully where oil and gas development and other energy development can go responsibly. And this is really what the people who are part of different Greater Chaco coalitions that have been put together over the years, this is what everyone wants, is responsible energy development. So, I think that's what we're looking at this point. And yeah, we're obviously waiting for more definitive action. And again, we hope that, this current administration will follow the regulations. and go through the full public process. Because we can't do dramatic things with our public lands without pulling in the broad public comment and input, especially from the dissenting communities, our indigenous friends who live all around us and whose lands border Chaco and Greater Chaco. So, that's just tremendously important.
Right, sure. And to play devil's advocate for just a moment here, I mean, again, you said earlier that the land around Chaco is not that suitable for oil and gas development, or it would have been done maybe already. So maybe some folks are saying, what's the big deal if this were to go through? If it's that bad for development, is it just that there could be, and it opens the door to possible development if prices go up and economics makes sense? Is that kind of the idea behind this too?
Yeah, that is the idea, Scott. And there are some oil and gas wells in that zone already. I wouldn't describe it as completely pristine in any way, but I've been fortunate over the last 15 years to have gone on a couple different flights that took off from the Farmington Airport, went south, trying to pick up the track of Chaco's Great North Road, from the 11th and 12th centuries, and then coming back out of Chaco, returning to the north. And the 10-mile zone is not something that someone decided by throwing darts at a board. Here's 5, here's 10, here's 20. The 10-mile zone is a legitimate area that deserves protection in its own right, and it really hasn't seen the effects of oil and gas except on its very margins. So that's one of the things we're particularly concerned about. And also, in the energy business, this in some ways, the way certain operators choose to pursue it, it's not that different from gambling or rolling the dice. They might buy up leases that haven't been super productive in the past and hope that they're going to hit something. So there's that certain element of chance in there. That, meanwhile, can despoil the landscape, can harm archaeological, cultural, and sacred sites. So essentially, I don't think, and a lot of the people, on this side of the issue don't think that we need to roll the dice on this and probably not have any significant boost, even if a well is in place and taps into some oil and gas, and if they're willing to take on all that economic risk. We think that's too risky of a position and just something we don't need to be doing when we can do it. Producers, operators can do it in areas with much higher rates of success and less damage to the places that we know are on the environment.
Got you. Understood. And again, you and I have talked too about the fact that over the past few years, I think you've done a lot of work to make this happen as well, and other organizations too, to make sure that these Native American communities and pueblos and other Native peoples who have ties to this space and this land are brought into the consultations and have a seat at the table and things like that. Is that also another concern about this moving forward? Is that maybe those voices aren't being heard as loudly as they had been in the past?
Well, it's always a concern when we have an administration that comes in and seems to want to put energy production, energy dominance, whatever the buzzword is coming out these days, in place of both consultation and close cooperation with the indigenous folks who live on the land and just protecting those special places. So yeah, it's definitely a concern. The federal government has trust obligations with every indigenous group in the country, every federally recognized group in the country. So they're required to do that. But the way they pursue that is subject to different regulations that different agencies have put in place. So, we've already seen shortened notice periods. We've already seen the administration moving forward saying, well, this is an emergency. We have an energy emergency, which really isn't borne out by any of the economic data. But if they're going to invoke emergency powers, then they may cut those normal periods of consultation for tribes to look at their maps, have discussions in their councils and say, do we have concerns about this area or that area? So yeah, we're tremendously concerned about that. And again, for just having what should be a very transparent and open public process that should unfold over months and years and not days or weeks, we're very worried about having that curtailed.
Got you. And of course, too, we have been learning more, I think, recently of other people's connections to this site, to Chaco Canyon and other sites here in New Mexico and across the Southwest. There's been more, I think, linkages and evidence come to light about a lot of these cultures' significance connections to Chaco Canyon? Am I remembering that correctly too? Is that a more recent revelation or not?
Yeah, no, definitely, Scott. Our organization at Archaeology Southwest has pursued a couple different studies with the Pueblos of Acoma and Zuni to get tribal members out to important points in the 10-mile zone on the landscape and see what information is there and whether groups connect. And our work did show indeed that these groups have connections to areas that weren't automatically assumed to be of great importance to them. And then the Department of Interior under the first Trump administration funded a large scale study that funded both the Navajo Nation and a coalition of Pueblo groups to get out on the land and go through a much more comprehensive process. They're still at the point of completely wrapping that up and getting results into a position where they can share them without compromising confidential information. But from what I've heard in there and what has been reported to the agencies, there are significant resources, sites, landscapes in the zone, in the 10-mile zone, and in other areas that have not previously been thought to be that important to different tribes. So, yeah, I think this is something that we pushed for to get that study funded, and certainly all of the indigenous groups in the Southwest and in New Mexico in particular pushed for that, and now they've been able to do that. So I think that does show that it's super important to have these types of studies done so that we have the best possible information to figure out how to manage these very important cultural landscapes. And, again, we're hoping that the current administration honors what we have learned and figures out how to go forward without compromising those values.
Sure, understood. And I guess it seems too, I guess for lack of a better term, a case of maybe whiplash of these administrations, changing regulations or these rules, every 4 years, right? And it seems like if I'm an oil and gas company, when I want to make any kind of investment in some activity, when it could be ruled not applicable 4 years from now.
Well, it does create a lot of uncertainty, I can
Yeah.
imagine, on the industry side. And that kind of, again, goes back to what, I was suggesting. And, I'm not involved in the oil and gas business, Scott. And, but I would probably want to be betting on a more sure thing. Obviously, the Permian Basin down in the greater Carlsbad area is a major, major producer. What I read recently is that's the second largest producing zone oil field in the country right now. And it's not that that's not without issues either. I don't have a lot of direct information, certainly
Sure.
something that could be pursued, but there is in the areas, some of the areas worked down there, a lower density of cultural resources, some of the same concerns, but not exactly what we're talking about around Chaco. So, and this isn't to say that there aren't important public lands in different parts of our state, but the area around Chaco does rise to a different level. And so, that's something that we ask, we talk about a lot, and we ask, Secretary Burgum and the folks making these decisions to carefully consider this and how important this area is. Again, to 90%, 95% of the people who live in our state and the visitors who come in.
Sure. And I guess the answer to all this would be for Congress to codify this in some kind of a law at some point that would then end the back and forth once and for all. That would be in a perfect world, which I realize, even through my rose-colored glasses,
Right.
we don't have at the moment, or if ever.
Well, we went through that process in 2019, and we got a bill through the House
Yes.
of Representatives with broad bipartisan support. We cleared 2019. It had been introduced in the Senate, but hadn't moved. We got into 2020 and the issues with COVID and the election year. And unfortunately, the bill expired in the Senate without action. At this point, both the House and Senate have bills introduced that are very similar to what Secretary Holland put in place and the earlier 2019 bill as well. It probably doesn't have a whole lot of opportunity to move in this particular configuration of the Congress, but it's in there, and folks will continue to reintroduce it, and we'll keep talking about it. So, And
Right.
again, at this point, this isn't some new or crazy or radical idea to protect these lands. This has been before the public, it's been before the Congress, it's been talked about for a very long time at this point. So those are all things that the current administration, we hope and we believe, and we would, urge them and push them to strongly consider that.
Sure. Makes sense. Well, we just have a couple of minutes remaining. Paul Reed, this morning, is there anything else that's going on? A bit of a lighter note that you want to share with us before we run out of time this month?
Well, the world of archaeology and anthropology continues. There's definitely things we can speak about in future shows that are
Right.
coming along. And that's what we talk about a lot on here, Scott, is we archaeology, anthropology is concerned with understanding our world in the most respectful way that we can. So, we're considering continuing to pursue that even with some of the challenges that are before us.
Well, that's important, and it's important to be able to continue to do that. And there's a lot of folks, as we mentioned, who've been really invested in the work that you and your colleagues do, and the other folks that you bring with you in all this, too. We've talked a lot about some of the younger, recent college graduates, perhaps, and others who are getting jobs in the industry, maybe some more indigenous workers as well, and minority workers that are bringing in their perspectives, too, which is another important part of your field, I would say.
Right, it absolutely is. And that's why, we continue to pursue the idea that everyone, every group has a seat at the table and that we need to be in that diverse marketplace of ideas and concerns, and that really improves our understanding of all the things we're trying to do.
Very true. Very true. Well, Paul Reed, I appreciate your time as always every month to spend some time with me to bring us up to speed on some of these issues that your industry is facing, our state is facing, our tribal nations are facing. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott. My pleasure.
All right. Good to see you. We'll see you next month. That's Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest, my guest here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.